What do we mean by regulation of international trade in goods? When did the regulation of trade in goods begin? And what is the importance of international regulation of trade in goods? Why? What does it mean in terms of national trade policies at regional level and at the WTO level? Which countries have been able to influence international trade in goods, multilateral, regulation in trade in terms of trade in goods, and how relevant is the history of international regulation of international trade in goods important to our trade policies today? So today I want us to look at this, to look at international regulation of trade in goods, basically in the context of giving it a historical context, looking at the history and how it has shaped, the international trade policy, both at national and international levels. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel Achach, the Executive Director, Regiolex Consulting Limited. Regiolex Consulting Limited is a consultancy firm based in Nairobi, Kenya, but with representation in different regions of the continent, the West Africa, southern part, and so on and so forth. So welcome to our session today. Today I would want us to look at history of regulation of international trade. And basically the context of this would be the current happenings, especially in the US. With the Trump's presidency, we've seen the implementation of the American First trade policy by the US President Donald Trump. And so we would want to have a small discussion about the history of regulation of international trade, and then contextualize, the current happenings in the US, and be able to see how this would be of relevance to especially our African countries in, formulating their trade policies, and also looking at it in the context of regional integration in the continent. We are looking at the approaches by, various regional formations in the continent, looking at the East African Community, COMESA, SADC, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, looking at how these then, form or inform the trade policy actions at the African Continental Free Trade Area. So, as you may be aware, the American government is currently implementing what is referred to as the American First trade policy. If you go back to the history of multilateral trade and look at the regulation of international trade from a historical perspective, the regulation at the international level was actually started around the year 1947 with the formation of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. And if you look at the antecedents, what generally led to this. These were the outcomes of the Second World War. At that time, countries were just coming out of the World War II, and America, as it were, and its allies in the Second World War, thought that the world needed regulation on international trade. And so they came together, that is the US and the allies in the Second World War, to basically, address or try to form regulations that would then deal with the international trade. The thinking behind this at that time was that if trade was regulated, it would help countries to address, the causes of war. The thinking was that there were economic factors that were very key and that led to, the Second World War. And if you just go back behind, before the Second World War, during and after the First World War, and even before then, you realize that before the multilateral trading system, we had what was referred more or less a multilateral, a bilateral approach, I mean, where countries would speak to each other and form an arrangement, a bilateral trade arrangement to deal with the trade barriers, as it were. Ideally, before the coming into place of this, as we the state system as we know it today, trade was free. Really, there were no barriers. There were no, of course, we didn't have the boundaries as we have them today. And so, with the formation of boundaries and the modern state system, then came in with the protectionism policy that we then started experiencing issues, issues to do with tariffs. Countries started developing tariffs to protect their domestic industries. And so, after the Second World War, then countries came together, the US and its allies, to try and address these economic causes of the Second World War. And the idea at that time was to form three international institutions that would be able to address these issues. The first institution that was to be formed was the World Bank, as it is known today. The second institution that was to be formed then was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the third institution at that time was the International Trade Organization. And the thinking behind this was that with these institutions, then it would be possible to address some of the challenges, the economic challenges that would have led to the Second World War at that time. So what happened then is that countries, the America and their allies, entered into negotiations, and these negotiations led to the formation of the World Bank and led to the formation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, as it is today. Unfortunately, the International Trade Organization never saw light of the day. Why? Because then at that time, because of the politics that were then, in the US, the Congress did not pass the charter that was to lead to the formation of, the International Trade Organization. And so what countries were left with were then trade rules that had been negotiated, what is commonly referred to as the GATT 1947. So what we see from this kind of, background is that the US has been very influential in terms of developing the multilateral trade policy from its very, inception. The US has taken a lead in terms of, showing the direction of the world in terms of trade policy. And so because the ITO was never formed at that time, the world trade was then governed by the rules, the GATT 1947, as they are referred to, for a period of time before an international institution was formed. And then what happened then is that there were then successive rounds of negotiations that were mainly spearheaded by the US and also, its allies, the European countries and the likes. It's important to understand that at this point, when countries were negotiating, majorly we were talking about trade in goods. There wasn't so much talk about trade in services at that point. Issues like intellectual property, investment had not yet come to fore. And so in 1947, when the GATT was formed, the negotiations then were mostly on trade in goods. And so countries were addressing issues, barriers to deal with trade in goods. We're talking about tariffs and non-tariff barriers that related to trade in goods. And so there were successive rounds of negotiations where countries met and discussed reduction in tariffs. But then, as the negotiations proceeded, of course, new issues started coming in. We had issues to do with the trade remedies that then came into discussion, issues with subsidies, dumping, safeguard measures, and so on and so forth. Later on, we had issues to do with intellectual property coming into fore. We had now discussions on trade in services coming into fore. And through successive negotiations, the idea of formation of an international organization that would regulate trade was still not lost. And so in the 1994, culmination of the Uruguay round of negotiations, we then had ultimately the formation of an institution that would then now regulate or administer these multilateral trade rules in the name of the World Trade Organization. And so you then, in this perspective, you're able to see the role that the US played from the, immediately after the Second World War, coming all the way to the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1994. And so one would safely argue that then the US basically led the negotiations and was in the forefront of the formation of the World Trade Organization as we know it today. And the idea, the approach at that point is that the US led most of the negotiations and so was able to direct, and show direction in terms of whatever their interests were. Remember, when we are talking about trade policy and regulation of international trade, we are talking about interests of the private sector. And at that time, the US had a very organized private sector that were able to push through their agenda in the formation of most of these trade rules. If you look at, for instance, the rules regulating trade in agriculture, you look at the rules dealing with trade remedies, you look at intellectual property, you see a lot of interests that came from the US, of course, substantially also from Europe, that also had a fairly well organized, especially the agricultural sector. So then what then happened is that remember, when we are talking about 1945 or 1947 for that matter, most African countries at that time were still colonies. We were colonies of the European countries. And so African countries were not on the table at that point when these rules were being negotiated. And so come 1994, then there's the aspect in which, what is referred to as in trade rules at the single undertaking, where all the members, any country that signed into the WTO, as it then were, would then become a signatory to all these agreements that had been negotiated up to that point. And so a number of African countries were actually founding members of the WTO and, signed into the WTO in 1994. And then, so later on, after the formation of the WTO, countries started experiencing a shift in the sense that whereas pre-WTO, the US had a very big role or a big voice in terms of the direction that the World Trade policy took. After the formation of the WTO, and then in 2001, China joined the WTO, and then we had a lot of emerging, a good number of emerging economies coming into fore. Then the developing countries started having a big say in terms of the direction of the world trade. And so we had a number of policies that were mooted by the US, but because of the organization of the rules of the WTO, as it were, the developing countries were able to, shoot down, if I may say, those approaches. And increasingly, there are also policies that the US put in place, and these policies were successfully challenged at the WTO's dispute settlement body. And so increasingly, the US then started becoming very uncomfortable with the WTO and its whole system. We had, talks from presidents saying that the WTO was not serving the interest of the US, or saying that the WTO was actually against the interests of the US. And so increasingly, the US became very uncomfortable at the WTO. And so what then happened after that is that the US, diverted their interests more to the regional levels. So we had then a lot of interest now from the US going to the regional formations. And so at that point, you'd see, the US entering into large, regional economic formations. If you remember, the negotiations on the transatlantic partnerships, the Trans-Pacific partnership agreements, you'd remember. And so the world basically changed, moved. A lot of efforts were then now put on regional economic blocks as opposed to negotiations at the WTO. Actually, because of this, the interests of the US that they felt were not being served. And this conflict, or push and shove, if I may say, between developed and developing countries at the WTO, you realize that the WTO has not been able to deliver so much in terms of multilateral agreements after its formation. Actually, I think there's only one agreement, that is the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and recently maybe the Fisheries Agreement that has come out of the WTO negotiations. And so there hasn't been much in terms of multilateral agreements from the WTO because of this pull and push between developing countries on the one hand and the developed countries on the other hand. And so the shift to regional economic formations, again, if you trace the interest of the US in these formations, you realize that the US has tried to put a lot of effort to develop those rules that they were unable to push through at the WTO stage. And so you'll have agreements that have been signed by the US containing clauses like to do with the trade and environment, to do with human rights and trade, to do with labor and trade, and so on and so forth. Some of these controversial subjects that they were not able to get unanimity at the WTO stage. And so suffice it to say then that the role of the US in terms of shaping the world trade policy has been very key and has been very pronounced. We're going way back to the immediately after the Second World War to date. And so, whereas a lot of gains were made with the formation of the WTO, a number of rules were developed, including disciplines on tariff measures, disciplines to deal with non-tariff barriers, and various aspects of international trade, really. We have experienced a shift with the coming into place of the current US President Donald Trump, who, as he mentioned, is implementing the American First trade policy. And when President Trump came into place, he was very categorical that he was going to apply tariffs, on certain imports into the US that he thinks are not serving the interest of the US. And so we had tariffs levied against goods from Canada, from Mexico, from China, from the EU, and so on and so forth. And so these have basically turned upside down, if I may say, the gains that had been made under the WTO. Remember, by also action or inaction of the US, the dispute settlement body under the WTO has also been moribund. The appellate body has basically been crippled because countries, there are no members. Members have not been appointed to that body. And so this, discomfort at the WTO and now the implementation of the American First trade policy has basically changed the world approach towards multilateral regulation of trade. And so then the important question that then comes, how does Africa respond to this, change or this shift in terms of trade policy? The main idea why we have the African Continental Free Trade Area was to consolidate, approaches by the African countries towards some of these issues of trade policies and also to increase intra-African trade. And so, whereas none of the policies that President Trump is implementing so far has been directed specifically towards Africa, but because we are part of the multilateral regime or the global trading regime, these policies are likely to affect exports and imports into Africa in one way or the other. And therefore, the African Continental Free Trade Area and really the trading blocs within the continent must then develop policies that would enable them to take advantage, of the environment, as it were, and improve, create a larger market within the continent so that the over-reliance on external markets is reduced to a certain extent, so that these shocks that are brought about by change in policy in these big, economies are sort of mitigated. You don't suffer a lot when there's a change in this. So basically, this would be the link between, what the American first trade policy that is being implemented in the US and the current state of affairs, as it were. At Regiolex Consulting, if you're interested to get a deep dive into some of these issues, have a more detailed training on the history of multilateral trade organizations, and even on the specific agreements that were signed under the WTO. We offer these trainings, specialized trainings on the agreements, that is the likes of, agreement on agriculture, trade in services, trade remedies, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights, agreement on investment, and so on and so forth. We offer specialized trainings on these WTO agreements and really the WTO law, as it were. And so if you are interested in having a deep dive in this, either at an individual level or as organizations, we can make tailor-made, courses that are trainings that address your key needs in terms of policies, policy positions, and how these agreements affect, movement of goods and services across the borders. Thank you.